grandchildren
All
on.
right. Hello, everybody.
Take precedence.
Okay. Well, welcome back, or welcome to. I finally decided to, mooch off of Andrew Lloyd Webber and just call this series Jacob and Sons. So what I'd like to do this week is look at Yaakov, and Yaakov rather than Yaakov and Sons, kind of focus a little bit on Yaakov and wives, because we kind of all know the surface story, but there's Shakespearean tragedy that's in the under the surface on both a textual and a Parshanut level, but also at a psychological level. And I want to use the Midrashim and the Mefarshim to kind of understand what's going on, and the more times I learn this, the sadder I get, but also the more awed I get that this family and these sons were able to bring themselves together, and come together as a nation that's survived for 3,500 years, because the beginning was not very auspicious. Okay, so we're in Parakaftet, we're in chapter 29, and we left off last week when Yaakov gets to the well. Okay, there are more short sheets hanging around. So I think we left off like at Pasuk Tet, right? We talked about that he kind of butts in, he tells him to do his job, and whether this is a good thing or whether this is intrusive, and, kind of, again, talking about what this reveals about Yaakov's personality, that he is very much a rule follower, and according to Rashi, he's jumping in here to tell them that they have an ethical responsibility to their employers, or an ethical responsibility to themselves, and that my understanding of what Rashi is doing here is saying, despite what we have just seen Yaakov do with the bracha, with Yitzchak, he is at core a deeply ethical human being, and he cares about emet. We say, right? Titain emet liYaakov, that you have given truth to Yaakov, and that we know that when you really believe in a value and you're deeply committed to a value, if you are then forced by circumstance or whatever to go against that value, that's awful. I mean, that's what in literature now we call a Sophie's choice, right? The idea of having a mother having to choose between her two children, or the stories that I've heard about immigrants from Europe having to decide, do I work on Shabbat? Do I not work on Shabbat? Do I support my family, or do I, remain committed to my religious faith? We've all encountered that. So I can only imagine that for Yaakov, whose whole essence, again, that ish tam yoshev ohalim, he's a purist in a lot of ways, and in some ways even a zealot, to have to go against that was so dissonant to him. So that here he's trying to kind of put things back in order. Now you can also see him as a nosy buddy, like just somebody who sticks his nose in where it doesn't belong, and we see a similar trait with Yosef. We'll get there. Apples and trees.
Mr. Tanky and Mr. Samuels, you have a student who says she has a date to meet you in the art room. If you can make it, please go. Art room is 234.
We love my okay, so they say to him, it's not time to see to gather the flocks, and then he sees Rachel, and then there's this big moment of you can hear the violins and the harps and all of this background music, and he sees Rachel. And this is where I want to pick up the story. We're in Pasuk Yud Aleph. Okay, so it says Vayashkefes etatzon. He first he moves the rock. Me'al pi ha'be'er. He moves it off of the well. Vayashkefes etatzon. Lavan achimo. And then in Pasuk Yud Aleph, it says, Vayishak Yaakov Rachel, he kissed Rachel, Vayisa et kolo vayik, and he lifted up his voice and he cried. And at this point, I stop and I ask my students, I stop and ask you, why is he crying? Like on a purely shot, don't think of Midrash, don't think of anything deep. Here he is meeting Rachel, he's, according to many opinions, 65 years old, but however old he is, he's had to literally run away from home, from his fratricidal brothers, had to leave his parents. Why is he crying?
Relief that he found that the mission was accomplished, and he found
Relief.
that he was looking.
Okay, so relief, maybe even gratitude. Why else might he be crying?
I guess sadness for what he left behind. He's been on automatic until now, just trying to survive.
Okay.
And all of a sudden meeting someone who he's connected with reminds him of what he's lost.
Okay, you were about to say something?
I say homesickness, it's kind of the same.
Homesickness. Okay, so sadness, relief, homesickness.
Hope for the future.
Hope for the future. Why else might he be crying? So, he's happy, he's sad, he's relieved, he's exhausted. It's a long trip from Be'er Sheva to Haran. Like, again, we have to remember that Haran is way up in northern Lebanon, southern Syria. And he's gone from Be'er Sheva, which even on today's modern highways is, probably an 8-hour to 10-hour car trip. Like, we're talking about a distance that's probably something from like here to Chicago or here to Cleveland. And he's not going by car, and he's not even going by camel. He's on foot. Okay, this is a several 100-mile trek over mountains and valleys and deserts, and that he's been trekking on foot, and he finally gets there. So Rashi brings two very well-known midrashim, which I want to look at because in my understanding, when Rashi brings a midrash, what he's trying to do is not, particularly in Sefer Bereshit, he's not trying to explain what a word means, like the literal translation, but he's trying to explain what's going on. Like you guys just offered perfectly legitimate reasons for why Yaakov cried. It makes perfect sense to say that he cried. We don't really need a deeper explanation, and that Rashi gives us one. Let me make sure I have my, so here it is. So the translation that you have is from Chabad.org. Okay, so that the text of the Rashi and the translation is from Chabad.org. When we get down to the Ramban in source 4, that's my own personal translation, so I don't want anybody to be confused. So we have two explanations. So the first one is the famous Rashi that he saw in Ruach HaKodesh that he wasn't going to be buried with Rachel. That's a really way out midrash. Like, how many leaps is that making? Number one, the leap is that he has Ruach HaKodesh. Number two, the leap is that he is going to marry Rachel. Number three, that she's going to die before him, that she's going to die somewhere else, and that they're not going to be buried together. Like, that's, I would say, like, if this were written by an English student in an English teacher's class, the English teacher, in her old-fashioned red pen would put, like, many question marks. Like, right? What's supporting this? Right? We're so used to this midrash from childhood, right? This is like what I call one of those archetypal first grade midrashim. Why did Yaakov cry? Because he saw in Ruach HaKodesh that he wasn't going to be buried with Rachel at Marat HaMachpelah. We learn that in first grade, or our children learn that in first grade, and we don't stop to think about it as adults. What is the midrash telling us about Yaakov and about the essence of his relationship to Rachel? What's driving that? That's not a rhetorical question.
And he and she would build a nation together, and said that after all that, they would not be going to perpetuity together.
Okay, so that their life together would only, so to speak, somehow only be in Olam Hazeh, and not in Olam Haba, or somehow there be unfinished business.
At the first moment, there was a deep connect, and immediately he felt there's a disconnect between them.
The first moment, that Romeo-Juliet moment, on the one hand, there's this deep connect, but in a much more profound way, there's already a disconnect.
Like a breach.
Like it's a breach.
Yeah.
And it's a breach that's not bridgeable. There's something already from the get-go. It's not till death do us part. Death will part us. Contrast that to when Ruth says to Naomi, Ubasher tamuti amut v'sham ikaver, right? However you die, I will die, and that is where I will be buried. Ki rak hamavet yafrid beini u'beinech, because death will only divide between us physically. It won't divide between us, so to speak, in Olam Haba. That's a whole different sheer parallels. Go ahead.
I would think that the Medrash should focus on not so much that they weren't buried together, but that she died young. Like that, it's very strange. They're so busy with like the graves, where it sounds like she could have just been buried someplace else, or a few months before him, or not that like the tragic early death. So
Right. And that's it. Like he doesn't see her tragic death. He just sees how it affects him. It's only later we get to the wonderful midrashim about her death and where she's buried and how redemptive that is and all of that. It's just it's weird. What I think is going on here also is that what Rashi is saying is that Yaakov was coming into this relationship with a very different perspective than Rachel. First of all, it's his perspective. My students ask me, or either they ask me or I ask them, did Rachel love Yaakov? Do we have any idea?
the strange man comes over and kisses her and then cries. She doesn't know who he is. She doesn't know anything. It's
Right.
strange.
Right, that's really weird. That would freak me out a little bit. But do we ever hear once in the text about how Rachel feels emotionally about Yaakov? We don't.
They've been hanging out for 7 years. Huh?
What?
They've been hanging out together for 7 years.
This is before the 7 years
Yeah, but
happened. But we don't know. And as a matter of fact, and we're going to get to this. I don't think we'll get to it this week. We'll probably get to it next week. Is that the one conversation that we actually hear between the two of them, the back and forth conversation, is an argument.
Mm-hmm.
So, he falls in love with her, whatever that means. We're going to talk about that in a second. We don't know what she feels. The story is like there's a myopia. It's almost like he can't, it's hard, he doesn't get the rest of the world like that's coming at him. And as we said last week, they're coming from two very, 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 very different places. And I think that's also part of this, is that there is a sense of, there's a break already before they even get started that can't be bridged. Now the second half of the second midrash, which is a little bit more logical than the first, which is he's crying because of the whole Eliphaz story, which I'm not going to get into, but the whole thing that he's crying because he's coming empty-handed. Now we know he's coming empty-handed. How do we know that he comes empty-handed?
He runs out quicker. I mean, it's a quick exit.
Okay, that's number one. But number two, how do we even know from the text, right? When he, 2 psukim from now, when he meets Lavan, and he hugs him and he kisses him and whatever, and he has no money. That's why he has to work for him. Forget about all the midrashim about Lavan, like literally feeling him up for money. That's again. But the bottom line is he has no money, and he's crying because he's arriving at his uncle's house, his cousin's house. He's arriving empty-handed, and he's arriving with this deep sense of legacy, right? My grandfather Abraham sent his servant Elimelech with 10 Sam, thank you, Eliezer, 10 camels laden, and I have nothing. So, to me, again, what this is saying about Yaakov is like he has such a deep sense of being, like being somehow second best. Like he's second best to Yitzchak, and now he's even second best to Eliezer. Like there's a he's the second twin. His father doesn't love him as much. He had to trick his brother. He had to trick his brother again. He had to be, at odds with his own personality. He's just like this constant. That's the Yaakov, right? He's fighting. He fights with the Malach. He's never quite at peace, which is possibly why later, when he does have this battle with the Malach, which some of the Midrashim really say was a battle with himself, that's why it says he comes out, even though he's been wounded, it says that he comes out shalem. It's like it's only after that battle and after he becomes Yisrael that he kind of becomes somewhat at peace with himself. But here he certainly is not. There's a real dissonance. Not a really great way to go into parenthood, as we will see. Okay. Moving right on. Okay. So he goes to Lavan. We know the story. He goes to Lavan and he comes empty-handed, and he stays there for a month. And he's living in Lavan's house, which we established last week is a very different house than he grew up with. It's different morally, and it's different culturally. Haran is a city. He grew up in the sticks. Lavan is a businessman. His father was an heir to great wealth. His father was a shepherd, made money off of sheep. In a way, it's kind of Cain and Hevel revisited. Rav Hirsch explains Cain and Hevel as being Cain being nomad, Hevel being nomadic shepherd, which on the one hand.
Can everyone come pick up their Mayanei Torah? And if you don't see your name, it's probably under a different pile, so look carefully.
Okay. That Hevel as the shepherd, which we tend to think of shepherds as very positive images, right? The kings, the prophets, because they are caretakers, they're custodians. But you think about what the word Hevel really means, which is emptiness or nothingness or vanity or the breath that comes out of someone's mouth. A shepherd is somebody who's nomadic and never really has permanence, whereas Cain is from the word kinyan, to acquire, and that an agriculturalist, which eventually becomes an industrialist, is somebody who amasses great wealth and great power and great stability, but the flip side of that is also great arrogance. So Yaakov is coming from this nomadic shepherd with all of its pros and cons. He's very sheltered and kind of his head somewhat in the clouds, and his father certainly had his head in the clouds because he was a korban, and he's coming into this urban center. It's like, like the kid from Kansas, the stick, you're not in Kansas anymore, is that, comes to Manhattan for the first time. Like you hear all these stories, the kid from Idaho or Iowa or wherever out there, where a large town is 1,000 people comes into Manhattan and really knocks you for a loop. So that's Yaakov in Laban's house, and he is there for a month. And then we have this really weird conversation. We're in Pasuk Yudal. And Laban, and Laban says to him, Ach atzmi ubisari ata, you are my flesh and blood, which, by the way, is the same phrase that Adam uses when he recognizes that Chava is not only his genetic counterpart, but his emotional counterpart. So you're like me. You're one of me. Okay. Vayeshiv, and then it says Vayeshiv imo chodesh yamim, and he lives there for a month. Which so you think okay, he's been a guest. Vayomer Lavan liYaakov amen pasuk tekva. Hachi ata, behold, you're my brother, my relative. The avadatani china, and you've been working for free. Okay. Hagidin li ma maskotech. So tell me what is your age? And then we have the famous.
Hi, if I call your name, could you come to the lobby and pick up your Hermione Torah? I'm just gonna say your shul. And your name. So Miss F, Young Israel, Eliana Kohler, Young Israel, Smart Cohen, Agudas Shalom, Hannah Siegel, Nina Miller, Eliana Dowd, Shir Rothblack, Noah Barda, Abby Stiefel, Alyssa Newgershell, Mrs. Shapiro, Mrs. Goldstein, Mrs. Herzog, Or Freeman, Sammy's mom, Kai Robinson, Viewer Walsh, Shoshana Martyr, Maury Levine, or Dr. Levine, Mrs. Lemnicki, Eliana Zactor, Reva, Shoshana Black, and Mia Prager. Thank you.
Rita Levine is going to have a really long trip to pick up Hermione Torah because she's an MM1. Gotta tell them that. Anyway, so he says, you've been working for me for free. And
Mrs. Hirschfeld, if you're in the building, please call the front office.
And now tell me what your wage is. And then we have this very strange little interlude that describes Rachel and Leah's appearance. And then in Pasuk Yudchet, it says, Vaye'ehav Yaakov et Rachel. And Yaakov loved Rachel. And that leads us to one of that juxtaposition, leads us to one of two conclusions. The not so favorable conclusion of the juxtaposition of, the older one was Leah and the younger one was Rachel, and Leah had soft eyes and Rachel was pretty or nice to look at. And then it says, and Yaakov loved Rachel. So option number one is, two sentences put together, he loved her because, right? And Rachel was beautiful, and he loved her. And he loved her because she was beautiful. That doesn't sound so good. Option number two. When you've got two sentences that could be juxtaposed to one another like that. He loved her despite the fact that she was, or not only because she was beautiful. Okay, because Yaakov being a mature adult at that point, as we get older, what do we know about beauty? It fades, right? It fades. So if we assume, like Rashi, like Seder Olam assumes, that Yaakov is 65 years old, we can work under somewhat of an assumption. We don't know how old Rachel and Leah are, but we all assume that Yaakov is this, young stud, and Leah and then Rachel is like the hot young chick, choose your teen or young, starlet, and Leah is the ugly duckling. We have no support for any of that in the text. Okay? According to Seder Olam, Yaakov is 65, and does all mathematical calculations to show that. We have no idea what Leah looked like, except for her eyes. We know that Rachel was pretty, but we don't know what that means. It says Yifat Mareh and Yifat Toar, so does that mean that she was like sweet, or was she drop dead gorgeous? One of the Mefarshim says it means that she was symmetrical, that all of her body parts were, quote unquote normal. So she was, it's not so much beautiful as pleasing to the eye. So, and that he loved her having nothing to do with her appearance.
But then why else would that has a be there?
And then,
they're too close together for you to think there was no connection.
Right.
And they have nothing to do with like the answer before, the issue before. So it leads you to think that is a reason why he wants to stick around.
Right. So the question therefore becomes exactly what you said. What does those two psukim tell us about Rachel and Leah? What is the text, if you look closely at the text about these two women, what do we know about them?
It might suggest that he wanted love anew, that one was more attractive and Leah, really older, not being as attractive, and that's the order in which he wanted to marry them off. That this was his plan. Whatever would happen, he wanted Leah to be married first.
So you're saying it sets up what happens
sets up
later. Okay, that's a possibility. So it might explain love. The question is as follows. If you look at the words of the text, right, and Lavan had two daughters, The name of the Gidolah, and I'm purposely not translating that, is Leah. And the name of the Ketana is Rachel. And Leah's eyes were rakot, which literally means soft. And soft could be like a soft teddy bear brown, or soft could be like weak. In other words, she couldn't see well. And again, the midrash here is that they were soft because they were red. It doesn't mean that they were red, it means that they were like puffy from crying. The Rachel hayita yifat Torah, and Rachel was beautiful in her description, v'yifat mar'eh, and beautiful in her appearance. What do we know about them? Do we even know that one was older than the other by any significant amount?
Maybe because they mentioned Rachel, Leah first. You just think
So she's the Gedolah, and how does Lavan refer to Leah?
Gedolah.
Not as the Gedolah, right? When Yaakov is duped, he's
The
like, what-
Bechira and the
Bechira.
Tzira.
Right, okay. One is the Bechira, one is the Tzira. So, how much age difference could there be between Leah and Rachel? Could be. How about 11 minutes? According to one of the Midrashim, they too were twins. Okay. Again, we have this image, right, of the ugly duckling and Cinderella. We have to go back and look at the text. One of the explanations for why Yaakov was duped that night, because they were identical, where they looked enough alike that you couldn't tell the difference in the dark. And remember, in those days, it was in the dark and there was no talking because you're in a tent and there are people all around you and you really don't want to advertise, right? Candles on, there's shadows. You're talking, everybody hears you. Like when I read these stories of how babies were born in the camps and in the ghettos, like it blows my mind. Like where did people literally find space to be physically intimate with each other? Forget about the desire to be intimate. It's just the power of the human spirit is really something quite astounding. But we also know that when the Torah uses Gidolah and Ketana, what else could it be referring to? What is Gadol? When you talk about height, that's one option. One was taller, one was shorter. What else?
Importance.
I can't hear you.
Importance.
Importance. Right? One was more important, one was less important. What else do we usually use the word? Talk about an Adam Gadol. Chashuv, right? He's important. He's a tzaddik. And which we'll get to in a few minutes, that the Ramban supports that view. And so does the Midrash, right? Why was Leah ostensibly crying? She doesn't want to marry Esau. She doesn't want to marry the bad brother. She knows there's an older brother and a younger brother, and an older sister and a younger sister. So she doesn't want to marry the Rasha. It's very possible here that the Gidolah is the one, the greater tzaddikah. Let's think about how Leah acts as the story continues. Who's jealous of whom? Rachel is jealous of Leah. Like, she wants the children. She said, Leah says, like, you took my husband, meaning you took his love. Now you want my dudat, you're my son's dudat. Even that's next week. We're going to talk about sons and lack of boundaries and Oedipus and all this kind of fun psychological stuff. But, so that, again, we have these preconceived notions of the text. And what the text and what the Mefarshim and what the Midrashim are telling us is, wait, hold up on those preconceived notions. Gidolah and Ketana could be referring to age, could be referring to height, could be referring to in status, but could also be referring to their moral quality. And all of a sudden, it's just like we walk around with this impression that it's Hevel, that's the tzaddik, and Cain is the rasha. When it's not so simple, we start seeing that it's not so simple that Rachel is Cinderella and that Leah is the ugly stepsister. That it might really be the opposite, and kind of to build on what you're saying. So not only does Yaakov potentially fall in love with the pretty one, but he falls in love with the pretty one that might not be so nice. which might explain why the other famous midrash of Rachel giving up those simanim to Leah is brought in. It's a complicated story. It really depends on how you start coming to view these people. And I think that the point of it is that it is complicated. These are not simple people, and the emotions that are going on here are not simple emotions. And he responds to Lavan, what do you want? And he says, Vayomer e'evodcha sheva shanim v'Rachel bitcha ha'katana. And I brought down the Rashi there, right? He has to be very specific. So what does this tell you about after 1 month of living with Lavan? What does Yaakov already know?
He knows Lavan.
He knows Lavan. He knows that this is not a simple situation here. So now we embark on this 7-year process. Okay, we're now in 2016. Try and think back, where were you in March of 2009? I don't really remember. It's my 3rd year in my older niece was a senior. Like, it's hard to remember 7 years. 7 years, like, we think of 7 years as not so long, but 7 years is actually a long time. And these 4 people are all living in the same little clan for 7 years, day in, day out, day in, day out. And for 7 years, day in, day out, Leah knows that she's not the one to marry Yaakov. Yaakov knows that he wants to marry Rachel. Rachel knows that Yaakov wants to marry her. Rachel knows that she is going to marry Yaakov. She knows that Leah is not, right? In psychology, when you, love triangles are always tragic. Any kind of triangle is a recipe for difficulty. So before this story even begins, psychologically, it's already compromised. Yes?
This kind of reminds me about what you said about why Yitzchak liked Asa. Maybe sometimes we are attracted to someone who's the opposite of us. So maybe Rachel, maybe Gedolah meant that maybe Leah was more of the Yoshev Ohalim type, and she isn't out in the field. She's not the one bringing as well,
right,
or whatever.
That's very possible.
And so he's, as much as he's upset about his father's choices, sometimes inevitably we fall back into a certain pattern. Like that.
Which is interesting. What you're raising is that really Rachel is kind of I don't mean to say in a moral sense, but certainly in a surface sense, she's more of an Esav kind of character, in the sense that she's attractive and she's just like Esav was, ruddy and healthy looking, and just like Esav was outside and he was a hunter. Rachel, and it says V'hi Rachel ro'ah. She is a shepherd. She's a shepherd by trade. And the question that the Mefarshim argue with is the fact that she was a shepherd make Laban look like he's cheap, which is what Rashi says. The Sforno says that no, she's a shepherd by default because her sister couldn't see very well. Her sister couldn't tolerate the sun. So she had to be a shepherd. There was no choice, and he apparently had no sons, but whatever it is, she is the outside person. In that sense, she is as much Yaakov's opposite as Yaakov was Rivka's opposite. So we have all of these lines that keep crossing and recrossing, and problems arise. Okay, moving. Yeah.
So, when we talk about that Yaakov did all the specifications of Rachel and the younger daughter, etc., it's also a reflection of who Yaakov is, not only what he saw in Laban. In other words, Yaakov himself is now being the deceiver. Yaakov himself, from what you described with the first midrash that we read, in other words, he doesn't have a great self-image. He's not very trusting of the world. And so he brings that himself independent, perhaps, of who Laban is.
That makes a lot of sense. That, that he's saying, I know things are not smooth and easy. I know that things don't always work out the way they're meant to. And I want to make absolutely sure that this works out the way that I want it to work out. But you can also say, because he is Yaakov Avinu, that he understood that as the younger son, he's supposed to marry the younger daughter. Just like they had that set of assumptions, he probably also had the same set of assumptions. And wanted to make it work out the way he thought his mother would want it to. I'm not trying to paint Yaakov or Rachel or Leah darkly. I'm trying to flesh them out so that they're not these two-dimensional images that we often walk around with. Because two dimensions they're not real to us. I say to my students, is like what makes these characters tzaddikim is that they were complex and yet they were still tzaddikim. They overcame that there's still something so profoundly amazing about them. And therefore, I can expect that of you, my students. God can expect it of me because he's not expecting perfection. He's expecting, us to wrestle with ourselves and move beyond. So I want to just, be very upfront with that. The wedding, the famous wedding night. Okay. So, and behold, in the morning, and it's 20 pasuk of Hay, Vahi b'boker, v'hinei Leah. And he says to Laban, Vayomer Laban, ma zod asita li, what have you done to me? Halo b'Rachel avadati, avadati ima. Was it not for Rachel that I worked for you? V'lama rimitani, and why did you deceive me? And no, it is not coincidental that the Torah puts those words, the same shoresh as Yitzchak said to Esav, ba achicha b'mir. Right? That's karma bit. He got it. Aviv Zorenberg always says that nothing goes without consequences. Right, wrong, good, bad, there are always consequences. So we have this very interesting scene, and again, the very famous midrash of the whole simanim thing. I think it's source number 3. Right? What do you make of that midrash? Right? What does it mean in the morning she was Leah, Halo Balayla? Wasn't she Leah also at night? Midrash says because Yaakov and Rachel knew that it doesn't take rocket science to figure this out. And they had set up all of these signs and secret handshakes and whatever. And then Rachel sees at the last minute that Laban is going to take Leah and that the deceit is going to be carried out. And she has to make a split-second decision of either her sister will be humiliated publicly or not. And she chooses the not. Yes.
The ceremony of putting the veil.
That's why we do it. Yes.
Correct. But did it take place then?
No.
So Yaakov saw Rachel, did he? And then at night it wasn't Rachel.
So the question is when did the switcheroo happen? There's actually a machloket of did she come? Does the husband do the veiling because the bride was brought to Yaakov already veiled, and it was considered unsanu? In other words, the first time you, so to speak, see your wife is when you're married. Or was Rachel brought to him unveiled? He saw that it was Rachel, and then, after, during the festivities when people were drinking or whatever, and it was already dark. That's when the switch was made.
Isn't there a halachic problem that he wasn't married to Leah? Even if you think about the concept.
No, because the deed, not to sound crass, once in this is before the Mishnah, the deed is done. The deed was done with kavanah to do it, ergo, it is done.
And publicly.
What?
Publicly.
Right. In other words, he consummated a marriage for the sake of consummating a marriage. That marriage is now consummated. Even if he thinks it's a different person, but Leah is now legally married to him. Yeah. So let's go back to the medrash. What is it? Why did Rachel do this?
Love of her sister.
Feeling.
Maybe the same pressure, like it's just like Rivka pressured Yaakov, Laban maybe pressured her.
Which actually the Ramban works on. We're going to get to the Ramban soon. Works under that presumption that there was pressure, or you could say that just like the text tells us how almost irrationally Yaakov loved Rachel, it was that same love that Rachel, not that she had it for Yaakov, but that she had it for her sister. Either way, it's a messed up way to begin a marriage. Okay. P.S. There is an interesting P.S. to this. It's a medrash in Eicha, which is also brought down in her Lamed Aleph of Sefer Yirmiyahu. I know this because I taught it. Very famous medrash that before the Jews were to be exiled and the Beit HaMikdash was to be destroyed, all of the Avot and the Imahot went before God one at a time to plead with him not to destroy the Beit HaMikdash and exile the Jews. You know, when Abraham says, I left my home and I sacrificed my son. And Sarah said, I was taken into Paro's house and taken captive. And Yitzchak said, the Akedah. And Rivka, said her piece. And Yaakov and Leah, they all said their piece. And it was when Rachel gets to God, and according to the Medrash, she says, I tolerated my rival in my house, and I am flesh and blood. You, God, who are God of the universe, you can't tolerate your rival in your house? Which is and then that's why it says, Mini kolech mibechi. That's why that conversation is dafka with Rachel. Kol birama nishma mihi bechi tamurim. That kol birama is not just on a high hill physically, but it's on high. The voice is literally heard in the high places. That Rachel is arguing with God. And God capitulates, as it were, and says, okay, you made your point. I am going to destroy the temple. I am going to exile them, but they are going to come back. It's not permanent, because if a human being can do what you did, right, sacrifice her love, her life for another human being, then I think I can put up with some problems from these, Jews. So, bad way to start a marriage. Yes?
You asked the question before. We know how Yaakov felt toward Rachel. We do not know how Rachel felt toward
Correct.
Yaakov. And it's her willingness to give Leah the signs that they can, perhaps, yes, she loved Leah, but she had some ambivalence toward Yaakov. She had not yet come to love him.
Right. It seems pretty clear from the Midrashim, and we're going to get to another one, that Leah desperately wanted to marry Yaakov and wanted Yaakov to love her. That's clear from the text of the next parak. We don't know what Rachel felt. And she certainly felt proud to be his wife and wanted very badly to bear his children. But we don't know how she felt about him as a person.
Well, why does there have to be this notion of love?
Correct, and that's what I happen to think that's in my understanding of Sefer Bereshit, is that this is actually a cautionary tale about the pitfalls of romantic love. That romantic love breeds problems, and that the view of marriage is more of a partnership, right? You've got two people. I hate to sound so crass, but it's not just an economic social contract. It's a religious social contract. You've got these two people who are joined together in one mission. And anytime that love comes into the picture, particularly if it comes in before marriage, we have problems. And I think that's telling. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but it's like nothing, just be careful. It's a very powerful emotion, and I think the Torah is saying there's the same power that could keep Yaakov constant for 7 years is the power that wreaked a lot of havoc amongst them and their children, the outcome of which was forever. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, I guess as you're talking to other things that are occurring to me as well, before we talked about that in some ways Leah and Yaakov are more like each other. And in fact, she loved him, and he was attracted to her. That Leah wanted Yaakov's love. Rachel wanted children.
Correct. They each wanted what they didn't have.
They each wanted what they didn't have, but it also speaks to who they are.
Yes. Yeah, it does.
But it also explains another explanation why Rachel gave Leah the signs, because she saw she would have this companion in this marriage, that she wasn't so,
Alone.
alone. At least she would have her sister wherever they went. And and it also, I mean, that love aspect also explains why even after, I mean, the power of love, even after Leah married Yaakov, she was still jealous of Rachel. And, again, you don't hear Rachel except for her wanting children. She doesn't.
Well, they're jealous of each other. And actually, I want to now segue to what happens after the marriage, because it's very interesting, because here's really where there's a split in the commentaries. So the wedding happens, Yaakov is upset. Laban says, okay, fine, let's go through Sheva Brachos, wait for the week to be out, then you can marry Rachel, but then you owe me another 7 years. And obviously, Yaakov is stuck. But in any case, we're now up to Pasuk, I think it's Pasuk Lam. And kind of a weird Pasuk. It says, Vayavo gam el Rachel, and he came, meaning in the marital sexual sense, to Rachel. Vaye'ehav gam et Rachel mi Leah, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah. Vaya'avod imo od sheva shanim achirot, and he worked with him, or for him, meaning for Laban, another 7 years. Very weird construction, very weird language. What do you take away from the gams? What does it sound like?
And he does love Leah. I mean, after they consummate their marriage, he does love her.
Which is what the Radak says. Okay, and I have the Radak here for you. I will translate it out loud. I apologize that I did not get to write a translation for it. It is source number 7. Yeah, it's source number 7. And it says, Lo haya Yaakov soneh ota, he did not hate her, aval haya ohev ota, rather he did love her. Ella lefi shehaya ohev et Rachel yoter, because he loved Rachel more, right? It says gam mi Leah, more. Therefore, the text in the next pasuk calls Leah a snu'ah. That snu'ah in the next pasuk, right? When it says in God so vayara Elokim ki vayara Hashem ki snu'ah Leah, doesn't mean literally. It means comparatively. Klomar keneged, in contrast, keneged Ahav lo haya Yaakov soneh. I'm sorry. Haita shel Rachel haita snua. In other words, compared to the love that Yaakov had for Rachel, then therefore, in comparison, he loved Leah less. And just like it says in Sefer Devarim, if a man marries 2 women, ve'achat ahuva ve'achat snua, and one is loved and one is hated. And the Gemara says, obviously, a man is not going to marry a woman that he hates, right? And she's not going to marry him. You're not forced into a marriage like that. So the Gemara says that achat ahuva ve'achat snua means one is loved more and one is loved less. Ulefi shahaya haita, aluva, I don't know why that hay is missing, and because she was insulted, she was wounded in her eyes, shelo haita ahuva, ke'achota, that she was not loved like her sister. Therefore, Ra'ah Hashem be'onya, Hashem saw her suffering, in other words, her personal internal suffering, Vayiftach et Rachman, and he opened her womb. So according to the Radak, he does love her. And actually, according to many Midrashim, he does love her. And that's why it says in the Pasuk that he also loved Rachel, meaning in addition to, he just loved her more than Leah. The Ramban, however, takes a different view, and his view is actually a pretty dark one. So I'm going to go back to source number 4, and הזכיר הכתוב שגם אהב רחל יותר מלאה. The text mentions that he loves her more. What does this mean? והטעם, and the meaning is, בעבור כי הטבע לאהוב יותר האישה אשר ידע האדם בראשונה. Because it's human nature for a man to love most or love more the woman with whom he has intimate relations first, right? Your first love. Kinyan, like it says in the Masechet Sanhedrin, and I purposely didn't translate that because I'm to this day not quite sure what that quote, how to translate it. V'hinei Yaakov ahav Rachel milea shelo kederech hateva. V'zeh ta'am. That's why it says God. And then he quotes the Radah, which is so he says clearly that despite the fact that he had relations with Leah first and with Rachel second, he loved Rachel. And not only that, the next source 5 is Hinei Leah rimta be'achota gam be'Yaakov. Yaakov, when it says that he hated Leah, according to the Ramban, it means it literally. Why did he hate her? Because not only did she trick Yaakov, but she also tricked her sister. And this goes back to what we were talking about a couple minutes ago. Ki im ne'emar, because if you want to say shenahaga kavod be'aviyah, that she was respectful to her father, behechnisa elav, and she submitted to him, be'al tamer bo, and she didn't rebel against him, hayala lahagid Oler Mos, that she should have either told or hinted ki hi Leah, that she is in fact Leah. In other words, she could have given him a sign in that tent very quietly, and they could have made a little charade and not gone through with it. Af ki hayeta mitnakeret kol halayla v'lefi kein lo hikira ad shera'a ota b'boker. However, she pretended all night long, and he actually did not know that it was her until the morning. Right? We hate that which looks like us. She reflected the thing that he hated the most about himself. Right? Lama rimitani, why did you trick me? And you could see from this Ramban, he's not only saying that to Lavan, but he's saying that to Leah also. You guys conspired, you plotted. Leah, you could have told me. There was a way. Veha Elohim yodeya, but God knows, ki lihinaseh el hatzadik asta, that she did this because she wanted to marry a tzaddik, v'richem alani, have mercy on her. V'kin amar v'bereshit rabban, so it says in the Medrash, kevan shera'a Yaakov ma'asim sherama Leah be'achotah, Natan da'ato legarsha. He hated her so much that he was going to divorce her. But then it says in the pasuk, and God saw. What did God see? The thing that only God can see, meaning he saw Leah's heart. He understood what her motivation was. The only reason she did this was not to trick her sister, to trick Yaakov, but she was a tzaddikah who was determined to marry the tzaddik and not to marry Esau. And because God remembered her with sons, Amar, Yaakov said to himself, Le'iman shel elu ani megaresh, zetam vayar Elokim. Am I going to divorce the woman who's given birth to my children? And that's the meaning of the words vayar Elokim. So it gets worse in the eyes of the Ramban. This is bad. This is really bad. That, Yaakov feels that Lavan has tricked him. Yaakov feels that Leah has tricked him.
Why doesn't he feel that Rachel has tricked him too? Why does he have no animosity towards Rachel?
Because she had no choice in a way. I mean, unless you want to say that she's complicit in giving Leah the sign, but that, if anything, that makes her look even more selfless, right? And she's unwilling to humiliate her sister in public, and that makes her look more self-sacrificing. So we come out of this whole parak not in really good shape. And then Reuven is born, poor guy, right? She gets pregnant. Rachel remains in Akara, ותהר לאה ותלד בן ותקרא שמו ראובן כי אמר כי ראה Hashem ba'oni. God in fact saw or understood, he understood what I was going through, my suffering, כי אתה יהבני נפשי, because now my husband will love me. And we're gonna actually, I'm gonna stop here first of all because it's 2:00, but second of all, what I want to do next week is we're gonna go through the 12 sons, because by understanding their names and by understanding the dynamics around how they were born and all of that drama, that sets us up for the Yosef story. Happy times. Good times. Because, let me see, it's like amazing that this nation survived, you know? Like the House of York and them, they didn't survive with much less fratricide. Okay, Chag Purim Sameach, and I will see all of you in 2 weeks. And if somebody could turn off the little thing over there.
Clearly is in on it, and it kind of has her okay. You know.
You can either see